The Buddha said that all he taught was dukkha and the ending of dukkha. Its primary meaning is simple enough: pain, but it covers all levels of pain, from acute physical suffering and mental anguish to subtle levels of stress in very refined, even blissful states of mind. In his first talk, the Buddha taught that the path to the end of suffering started with right view concerning four noble truths: suffering, its origination, its cessation, and the path to its cessation. The Buddha began his explanation of the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, not with a definition, but with a list of common examples. The suffering of birth, aging, and death, of sorrow, lamentation, physical pain, distress and despair, of association with the unbeloved, of separation from the loved, and of not getting what you want. Except, for the last, none of these examples needs any explanation. The canon explains not getting what you want as referring to cases where you're subject to any of the other examples of suffering, such as aging, illness, and death, and want to be freed from them simply through the power of wishing or prayer. The frustration of not being able to wish these forms of suffering away does nothing but add more suffering on top of the suffering already there. Instead, you have to focus your desires on following a course of action that will bring all these forms of suffering to an end. Up to this point, the Buddha's explanation of suffering deals with things that are perfectly familiar. We've all suffered in these ways ourselves, or seen other people suffer from them. Then, however, he summarizes the suffering common to all these examples, and this is where he enters unfamiliar territory. The Buddha says the 5 clinging aggregates are suffering. This too, he says, is something we've all experienced, simply that we don't understand it in these terms. Only when we understand what he's referring to by this summary can we begin to comprehend the first noble truth. Aggregate means heap, group, or mass. It also means the trunk of a tree, a meaning that we'll see is relevant to this context. It's important to understand that the mind does shape the aggregates toward purposes, and that, although those purposes can often be random or conflicting, they can also be more or less consistent, a fact that makes a path of practice possible. Form, any physical phenomenon. Although the Buddha's focus here is less on the physical object in itself and more on the experience of the object. In terms of your own body, the primary focus is on how the body is experienced from within. If feeling tones of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain. Perception, the act of recognizing, mentally labeling, and identifying experiences. Fabrication, the intentional shaping of experience. Consciousness, awareness of the 6 senses, as in the 5 physical senses, plus the mind as the 6th. There's something of an anomaly in that the term fabrication, in some contexts, covers all 5 aggregates and, yet, in others, is listed as one of the 5. That's because the mental act of fabrication shapes your experience of all physical and mental phenomena in the dimensions of space and time. It chooses among the potentials for any of the aggregates made available by past actions and turns those potentials into the actual experience of those aggregates in the present. A simple example: past memories will shape new fabrications. It's important to note that the canon defines the aggregates in terms of verbs. Feelings feel, perceptions perceive, even form deforms, making the point that these aggregates are processes and activities rather than solid things. As for clinging aggregates, this expression doesn't mean that the aggregates cling. Instead, it refers to the act of clinging to the aggregates. In fact, the suffering lies in the clinging. The act of clinging is suffering. The experience of the aggregates on their own, without clinging, may involve some stress, in that the aggregates continually change in dependence on conditions. But if there's no clinging, that stress doesn't weigh down the mind. This means that the suffering referred to in the first noble truth is the suffering of clinging. The aggregates aren't the problem. The clinging is. Still, to understand clinging, you need to get a sense of what it clings to. Each of the aggregates is associated with the act of feeding. In the Buddha's analysis, the act of feeding is something that all beings have in common. In fact, that's how we define ourselves as beings, by latching on to these 5 activities as we feed. When you feed, either physically or emotionally, all 5 of these aggregates are involved. It's important to remember, even though there are physical and mental aspects to the 5 aggregates, we are mostly interested in the mental aspects here. Form. When you eat physical food, form refers both to the form of the body that needs to be nourished, and that will be used to look for food, as well as to the physical objects that will be used as food. Form applies to whatever form you assume for yourself in the imagination, and to the imaginary forms from which you take pleasure. Feeling. You start with the painful feeling of physical or mental hunger that drives you to look for food. Then there comes the pleasant feeling of satisfaction when you've found something to eat, followed by the added pleasure that comes when you eat it and satisfy your hunger. You use perceptions to identify the type of hunger you feel, and to identify which of the things in your world of experience will satisfy that hunger. Perception also plays a role in identifying what is and isn't food. This is one of our most basic perceptions. When children crawling across the floor encounter something new, they put it in their mouths to determine whether to perceive it as food or not. Fabrication. In the context of feeding, this covers the ways you contemplate and evaluate strategies for finding food, taking possession of it when you find it, and fixing it if it's not edible in its raw state. Consciousness is the act of being aware of all these activities. This shows that even though the term aggregate may not be familiar, it refers to activities that are not only very familiar to all beings, but also intimately connected to your sense of who you are. We are how we eat. When we use these activities to feed, they acquire positive associations in our minds. But in the First Noble Truth, the Buddha tells us that the act of clinging to them is suffering. We feed off the aggregates in the same way that a fire feeds off the trunk of a tree as it burns. The implication here is that suffering comes from a double level of feeding emotionally off the activities that go into the act of feeding to ease our physical and emotional hunger. This is a second point that goes against the grain. Ordinarily, we enjoy clinging not only to our food, but also to the act of clinging itself. To accept the Buddha's analysis of suffering in the First Noble Truth, we have to develop some dispassion for the things to which we cling, and for the act of clinging itself. This makes the First Noble Truth difficult to accept, but it's also what makes it noble. It teaches us to step back and raise ourselves above our hunger. We work toward this dispassion by following the duty that corresponds to this truth. Instead of running away from suffering or trying to push it away, we patiently observe it with the purpose of comprehending it. We need to see for ourselves how the suffering is not the mere fact of physical pain or stress. It's actually identical to the act of clinging. Full comprehension comes when we understand clinging, to the point where we have no more passion, aversion, or delusion around it. The first step in comprehending clinging is to identify its various types. The Buddha lists 4. Sensuality clinging, passion and desire to find pleasure in fantasizing about and planning sensual pleasures. View clinging. Passion and desire for views about how the world is structured and how it works. View clinging is concerned with your ideas about what the world is and how it works. Habit and practice clinging. Passion and desire for ideas that tell you how you should act in the world. Habit and practice clinging covers your ideas of how you have to act in the world to get what you want. It's focused on your ideas of what you should do. Doctrine of self-clinging. Passion and desire for ways of defining who or what you are. Doctrine of self-clinging relates to your sense of yourself as, number one, an agent, capable of controlling events in an attempt to negotiate between what should be done, based on the way the world works, and the wants of number two, the consumer who will find happiness when those wants are satisfied. Both of these senses of self are overseen by the self as, number three, a commentator, who judges the actions of the agent to see if they satisfy the consumer and to decide if the consumer should raise or lower its standards for satisfaction. These three functions of the self are your basic set of strategies for finding happiness. The first three types of clinging define the arena in which your self acts and searches for happiness. The balance of power among the three types will vary from person to person and, even within a particular person, from moment to moment. The first three types of clinging define the arena in which the self functions. The Buddha identified doctrine of self-clinging as the most basic type of clinging of all. In fact, only in a teaching where this type of clinging is comprehended, he said, can people reach awakening. That's because your sense of who you are explains why you're invested in seeing the world a certain way and in believing that certain things should be done to attain what you want. Without your desire to gain pleasure for yourself, views of the world or of how you should act wouldn't have much hold on the mind. This may be why, of all the different forms of clinging, doctrine of self-clinging is the one on which the Buddha focused the most attention when explaining how clinging gets fixated on the 5 aggregates. According to him, you can identify the self either as identical with any of the aggregates, as possessing any of the aggregates, as containing any of the aggregates, or as existing within any of the aggregates. For example, you might identify yourself as your body, or as the owner of your thoughts, or as an infinite consciousness containing all 5 aggregates, or a little person inside the body, making use of its senses. These 4 possibilities multiplied by 5 aggregates give 20 possible self-identity views to which you might cling. So, it follows that doctrine of self-clinging is the most important type of clinging to comprehend. And if we look carefully at the 3 roles of the self, we can see most clearly why clinging is suffering. The self as consumer, even though it enjoys feeding, is constantly hungry. As the Buddha said, even if it rained gold coins, that wouldn't be enough to satisfy one person's sensual desires. This means that the self as agent has to be constantly at work, negotiating among wants and shoulds, trying to gain a measure of control over the way things are, all in order to assuage the hunger of the consumer, with the self as commentator never giving it a moment's rest. However, you can't uproot your sense of self without also uprooting the other types of clinging as well. Given that the self is what negotiates the world and tries to figure out how to act to gain pleasure, its identity is strongly linked to its range of strategies and skills for finding what it wants. These, in turn, rely on how it sees what is and what should be done. You see this connection most clearly when you move into a different culture or when your society undergoes radical change. The world is no longer what it used to be. The skills that used to get results come up empty-handed, and your very identity gets called into question. To survive, you need to construct a new self around new skills for negotiating the new arena in which you act. So, given that the roots of the self are entangled in its desires, its worldviews, and its ideas of what should be done, if you want to put an end to suffering, you not only have to uproot your sense or senses of self, you also have to uproot the other three types of clinging: your attachment to sensuality and to your sense of how you should act, given your views on how the world works. These facts about suffering define the strategy of the remaining three noble truths. Suffering can't be ended until you abandon the desires that lead to clinging. This is the message of the second truth on the origination of suffering. But those desires won't go away simply by wishing for them to go. A first step in abandoning them requires developing an alternative set of desires, with a new sense of who you are, of how the world works, and of how you should act in response to these new views. That's the strategy of the fourth noble truth, the path to the end of suffering. Once the path has done its work, you can abandon it too. When the mind is totally free of desire and clinging, it can realize the third noble truth: suffering's end. A bhikkhu once asked the Buddha, "Is there any form that is permanent, stable, eternal, not subject to change, and that will remain the same, just like eternity itself? Is there any feeling, perception, volitional formation, any consciousness that is permanent, stable, eternal, not subject to change, and that will remain the same, just like eternity itself?" The Buddha replies, "There is no form, no feeling, no perception, no volitional activity, no consciousness that is permanent, that is stable, eternal, not subject to change, and that will remain the same, just like eternity itself."